Greetings. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about the future of schooling. And while I may not have any definitive answers, I do hope this presentation provides a catalyst for deeper conversations around your staff room tables. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Dr. Jake Madden, and I'm the principal at St. Edward's Primary School here in Tamworth in Australia. We're a rural, non-selective primary school who just so happens to be a top 8 finalist in the Australian Primary Schools of the Year for 2021. Now, I've enjoyed a successful teaching and principal leadership career over the last 30 odd years in Australia and in the international sector, in particular the UAE. I'm a keen advocate for the school improvement movement, having researched and written about my exploits in schools for many years. Now, this presentation focuses on the influence on education with the view that not just understanding our history can help us improve schools, but also help point to future directions. You see, if we go back to, say, pre-World War II, this was a time where there was limited teacher training, limited rule expectations around that. Often the employing authorities were the training authority. Then we went through World War II, and in the aftermath, countries began to see population increases. There was a revolution in secondary education, and we moved from schooling for the elite to mass production of students. We were focusing on rebuilding nations, and at this stage we were moving into the baby boomer years. This led to the next period, where the formulation of education ministries occurred. Education became a political agenda. Open plan classrooms emerged with extensive restructuring of schools and classrooms. There was a major curriculum rewriting program. Parents became more involved in schooling, and we moved into the self-managing schools era. This is followed by what we affectionately call the Thatcher-Reagan era, where education policies were based on privatisation, competition, and the market economy. Schools of the future policies began to emerge, and this was followed by the fourth period, which is this period of the complexity of communications. We had the emergence of drill and practice regimes. We were branching into globalism as connections and our networking grew. It was during this period that the debate about literacy standards dropping was raised. We became more data evidence-based, and that was a common reporting program. The next era, I suppose, of education, was where the true globalisation emerged, and that's where we saw the nationalisation of education systems. You may recall the focus on becoming world class. The OECD in particular had put out a number of measures around that. And I suppose since the 1950s, our world population has basically tripled. Now, given the evolved nature of education, and as we look towards future opportunities, there are 4 key segments that I'd like to wander through during this presentation. Now, given the length of the presentation, I'm not going to be able to dwell deeply into each of the details, but just provide some summaries and raise the some anecdotal viewpoints for you. Now, most probably this won't be new to you, but hopefully it is useful information to refresh our conversations. So let me begin with what is influencing our life currently. Now, there's been a plethora of literature outlining what the human race is encountering at this moment, and I'd like to share my 5 key factors and I'll try not to mention too much about the global pandemic, but the first major factor impacting our lives, is this notion of globalization. Now, globalization has led to the facilitation of transnational networks and trade. Our human mobility is bringing economic growth back into our countries as we're able to easily move around the world. The next factor, is this notion of citizenship and democracy. You see, a well-functioning country, it relies on strong civic knowledge and skills of its citizens in order to thrive. However, I'm sure you'll agree that across the world there's been a declining trust and political and social unrest. Look, I don't need to mention things like Brexit or the ongoing civil wars around Syria and such, or even the various leaders' battles that are happening in countries right across the globe. The third factor is this notion of security and the concerns that we have for our own personal security. I mean, these are growing complex challenges. Whether we're talking about the broader issues of climate change or the security of data on the internet, or whether we're talking about societal changes or even family breakdown. Our personal security is something that's making its mark. And the fourth factor influencing us, is this aging population. As we're becoming older and living longer, the impact upon our retirement is pivotal. We have to prepare for living longer. People are working longer as a result of that. There's an increase of chronic illnesses. The diabetes and dementia are on the rise. And there's even, the social implications, particularly around the notion of loneliness. And the final factor influencing our life, I think, is this notion of the modern culture. There seems to be a declining sense of belonging to things. We see this in church affiliations or people volunteering to be part of community groups. Or even in the workplace, that lack of belonging. And with the pandemic and people working from home and the remoteness, the whole focus on well-being, is becoming at the forefront of a lot of organisations. And I think this is systematic of where we are at the moment. Now, all these factors, I think the common solution to resolving all these is that we place a strong value on the role that education may play. And I think that's important because given the promise of education, to be the solution, to the future, let's examine, the future of education in context of these global educational trends that I'm going to share in a moment. Now, this is to highlight two important goals. First of all, we need to help prepare the students for the changing world, and I suppose at the same time we're also getting to really understand how education can influence our personal impact upon the future. And that's not to forget, of course, that the future is quite unpredictable. Now, right across the world, there's this notion, as Pasi Sahlberg had coined a long time ago, a bit of a global education reform movement, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we're really focusing on this notion of standardisation, which has gone hand in hand with the institution of high stakes testing and accountability initiatives that have sought to create an international, national, and even regional systems, for measuring, for comparing and evaluating our educational systems and the outcomes we're trying to drive. When we look at this notion of international testing and the comparisons, using instruments like PISA and TIMS and PEARLS, they've sort of encouraged nations around the globe to narrow the standards and curriculum to simply maths and science and even basic literacy, which is often at the expense of the more broader forms of the liberal arts and progressive forms of curriculum teaching and learning. And and with this emphasis on quantifiable and measurable results, through testing and accountability, experimental and creative forms of teaching are being sidelined and even marginalised. As opposed to problem posing or collaboration or dialogical forms of knowledge construction in our classrooms. Teaching is becoming increasingly a scripted process for producing standardized and predetermined ends. It seems that education is being driven by market-based approaches that privilege the maximization of efficiency, of profit, or national economic competition, as opposed to the goals of say, full human development and the enhancement of our democratic social relations. And finally, the adoption of high stakes testing has been closely associated with a drive towards monitoring, rewarding, and even punishing teachers and schools, based upon student outcomes measured by these standardized and prescriptive test-based performance benchmarks. The conundrum for the education world at the moment is determining not only what the purpose of education is for, but what should we be teaching our students to prepare for that purpose? Well, I believe we're guided to a large degree by the research, by briefings and the articles of prominent organisations on what the future may look like. And there's been a number of these right across the world, as you can see on the screen now. But more importantly, what do these reports suggest that the skills that we are going to need to work within as we build towards that future? These thoughts are echoed in an OECD project which was launched around the 2017, I think, mark, called the Future of Education and Skills 2030 project. Now, the aim of that particular project, was to help countries find the answers to two key, far-reaching questions. The first, was about what knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values will today's students who are in our schools, who start kindergarten in, say 2018, what will they need to thrive and shape their world? And the second question, I think, was about how can the instructional systems develop these knowledge, skills, and attitudes and values effectively. Now, this position paper developed by the OECD was in response to their quest to find new solutions in a rapidly changing world, with the view that children who are entering the school, say in 2018, will need to abandon, what they think is the notion that our resources are limitless. They'll be centered on, I think, three key challenges that we need to overcome. And this report talks about the environmental, the economic, and the social. And you can read more about that, about their thoughts, at your leisure. So tomorrow's schools, will need to help students think for themselves. And I think, they will join others, with empathy, in work and citizenship. They will need to help students develop a strong sense of right and wrong, and hopefully point them in the right direction. Now, education leaders in countries all around the world over the last 5 to 10 years have been focusing their efforts to design, implement forward-looking policies and school practices. And while it may not be appropriate to simply copy and paste solutions from other schools or countries, looking seriously at good practice in our own countries and elsewhere to understand what works well in what contexts is certainly very beneficial. And that's exactly what has happened around the world, as coined by Pasi Sahlberg a few years ago when he introduced the acronym GERM, which is the Global Education Reform Movement. Every nation is undertaking a reform of some nature, and that's really important because not every country needs to follow the same as their neighbours and partners. They need to follow what's best for them by looking at what's happening well around the world, what's making a difference in different countries, and hopefully, picking the eyes out of those to suit their needs. Every country will develop their own educational direction. But education, we know is a fundamental right of every child throughout the world. It's an essential step to preparing young people, to become responsible, informed, and knowledgeable adults. I mean, education is probably the only means we have to fight things like global hunger and poverty, unemployment and inequality. Teaching a child how to read and write is essential, but it's not an education in itself. A good, well-rounded education instills a lifelong love for learning, a curiosity and the ability to critically question scenarios and rationalize solutions. It's inclusive of good social skills, communication skills, values and knowledge. And yet, not every child in the world receives even a basic education, far less a good one. And there are many barriers that we need to address. And I've just listed a few here, to whet your appetite. And a couple of them will stand out. I think, in a lot of places, the focus on the lack of leadership to guide good teaching and learning is certainly very prevalent. I think that the notion of attracting, retaining good teachers is a real challenge for many schools. And there's just a few other thoughts there that that you might be able to debate and discuss around your tables. You probably know that the fourth industrial revolution, is shaping life today, and the future of learning is just one powerful aspect of this massive revolution. Historically, if I just go back through this, is that the first industrial revolution used water and steam to power and mechanise production. The second used electric power for mass production. The third industrial revolution used electronics and information technology to automate production. And today, the fourth industrial revolution is building on the third and fusing technologies that blur the lines between the digital, the physical, and biological arenas. And the rise of AI is a very important part of this new industrial revolution. So therefore, as the world we live in changes, to embrace, I suppose, a technological future, how and what we teach in our education system must also be reshaped, to keep up to date with the growing demands of this 21st century. So if we synthesize, my meanderings in this presentation into what we need schools to focus on, I put forward, 4 key ingredients. We need, our curricula, to be focused on, real world thinking. We need our education, to focus on sustainability. And there's been a lot of work around, the notion of clean energy, recycling, and building a more sustainable world. The third key ingredient that the schools of the future must attend to is this learner centered pedagogy, and need to have the student, while at the heart, also needs to be focused on where each child needs to be at the end of the 12-month academic year, and help them to move forward. And I think the way forward, is this whole notion around professional learning communities, the professional collaboration, the competence that comes out of working in teams. I think is the key. And I think schools need to be more than just one teacher, one class, one room, one size fits all, and build a more learning community fabric around that. And that's what the work of Mark Treadwell has been a very strong impact upon my thinking as an educational leader. So what does that mean? If we move into the practical and to quickly try and sum up this presentation, the building of the future school is simply a difficult task based on all that is known about how students learn, the predictions for the world that they will face after graduation, and the vast disparities of opportunity and privilege that have existed for centuries. Continuing to use a traditional one-size-fits-all approach to teaching and learning, I think amounts to educational malpractice. Teaching the same units year in, year out adds to this. I believe, really that there are 10 major factors that influence successful educational design, and they're listed there for you. Again, to have a conversation and a debate around your tables. However, can I just finish with what I believe is the most important component, and that is, the teacher. In order to experience, long-term success, teachers need to develop, students need to develop a wide range of competencies and skills that cross all curricula. Teachers are no longer simply deliverers of content knowledge or trainers in skills in the 3 R's. They must help students to develop critical thinking skills, master a complex problem solving. They've got to be able to collaborate effectively, and they need to build healthy relationships and have strong interpersonal skills. I believe these are the new basics in education, and I think it illustrates why teaching is the most important job in the world. And our biggest barrier to the future school movement will be the lack of support that we give to the developing the future teacher. So again, that brings me to the end of my presentation in the 20 minutes allotted. Again, can I thank you for the opportunity to share some brief thoughts on the future of schooling. I wish you all the best in your conversations. And if you're ever passing through Australia, feel free to look me up. I look forward to catching you somewhere in the near future. Cheers.